Hey everybody, Peter Maravellis here, and on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and our partners here at Gray Area, I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the Logic Books Festival. Over the course of 3 days, we'll be exploring the way we interact with technology, how it affects our lives, and so on. We'll be also celebrating an important new collaboration between Logic Magazine and the publisher FSG Originals. This has led to the publishing of 4 new books, each exploring a unique and very timely theme. Logic Magazine was founded over 3 years ago with the aim of exploring technology and its effects on culture and deepening the discourse around technology. Being embedded in the worlds of the tech industry and tech culture, Logic's founders and editorial staff come from a very unique position to be able to kind of offer a very critical eye. Logic publishes its journal 3 times a year and challenges the promises that the tech industry make versus what it actually delivers. A specific theme is chosen for each seasonal issue and then rigorously explored in all of its aspects. So Logic's goal has always been to question the dominant assertions put forth by the upper echelons of the tech industry and questions, why are tools built? Who finances and builds them? How are they used? Whom do they enrich? And whom do they impoverish? And very importantly, what would a sustainable and a more equitable technology look like? So over the course of this 3-day event, we'll be considering many of those questions. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge Gray Area, our co-presenter and producer of tonight's event. They're a cultural center and educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. And their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civil impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art and design projects that benefit society in general. So to learn more about their calendar of events and workshops, please do visit grayarea.org. It's been such a great pleasure working with them in the past, and City Lights is really honored and thrilled to be working with them once again on this really fantastic project. So our first session tonight is called Blockchain Chicken Farm and Other Stories of Tech in China's Countryside. It's named after the book of the same title. As for each event over the course of the festival, there's an associated book. There are 4 new books in the series, and we'll be happy to be featuring all of them over the course of the week. So we'll be posting links in the chat function of your dashboard with which you can purchase copies of the book throughout the course of the evening. There will be a Q&A at the end of the talk, so please use the Q&A function located on the dashboard of your screen to post your questions and your comments. So our speaker for this session is the author of Blockchain Chicken Farm. I'd like to welcome Xiaowei Wang. They will be in conversation with An Xiao Mina. Xiaowei Wang is a technologist, a filmmaker, an artist, and a writer. They're also the creative director at Logic Magazine, and their work encompasses community-based and public art projects, data visualization, technology, ecology, and education. Their projects have been finalists for the Index Design Awards and featured by the New York Times, the BBC, CNN, Vice, and many other places. So they're working towards a PhD at UC Berkeley, where they're part of the National Science Foundation's Environment and Society Data Science for the 21st Century Research Traineeship. Joining them in conversation will be An Xiao Mina, who is a technologist, a researcher, and artist. She served as contributing editor for the book Ai Weiwei, Spatial Matters, and her own work has been exhibited in museums and galleries across the US and around the world. So welcome to you both. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Amazing. Thank you, Peter. Also, thank you to Gray Area, to City Lights for hosting these events, and also to An for moderating. I also really want to thank everyone for coming to this virtual event and celebrating the launch of these books in this moment. I know myself personally, I've been experiencing some Zoom fatigue, so please do what you need to take care during this time. I also want to say that since my book is about stewarding the land and agriculture, I feel that it's my responsibility to mention that I'm in the Bay Area on unceded Ohlone land. And if you are as well, I encourage you to check out the work of the Sogorea Te Land Trust, who are working to rematriate the land. So I will just start off by reading a very short selection from the introduction, just to give you a taste and tone of the book, and then An and I will engage in a scintillating conversation. Great, so this is from the introduction. The dynamics of rural China are not isolated to China itself. Yet because of its geographic distance from the United States, it remains a kind of periphery. These rural peripheries, the edges of the world hidden from view, enable our existence in cities. These areas produce everything from the cotton in the clothes we wear to the minerals that create the computers in data centers. They also produce the food that we eat. As humans, we eat to survive, and our appetite for food has carved new geographies and technologies into the world. Urbanite appetites have shifted rural economies, ecologies, and societies over the past 3 decades. In looking at technology in rural China, in places that show how globally entangled we are with one another, allows me to confront the scarier question that technology poses. What does it mean to live, to be human right now? Looking at tech in rural China forced me to examine the ideologies that drive engineers and companies to build everything from AI farming systems and blockchain food projects to shopping sites and payment platforms. These assumptions about humans and the way the world should work are more powerful than sheer technical curiosity. Embedded in these tools are their makers and builders' assumptions about what humans need and how they think humans should interact. It is not enough to critique these assumptions because in simply critiquing, we remain caught in the long list of binaries. Tech is dehumanizing, tech brings liberation, tech dragged the world into the mess it's in, and tech frees us from this mess. The difficult work that we face is to live and thrive beyond binaries and assumptions, and to aid and enable others to do so. So how do we begin this work? At the age of 95, 5 years before her death, the activist Grace Lee Boggs wrote The Next American Revolution. Published in 2010, the book sounded an alarm bell for our present condition, a time when politics was no longer politics as usual, and when ecological disaster wrought by unfettered material and technological growth was looming. Despite all this, she pointed to a source of hope, the Great Turning. The Great Turning, a term borrowed from Buddhism, refers to a growing tidal wave of people now taking the first step toward change, addressing spiritual impoverishment. These are the times to grow our souls, she writes. The way to respond to crisis is to practice compassion and change the cycle of suffering. And we can all actively practice compassion in our own way, whether we are doctors, teachers, or business people, or software engineers. So engineers and makers and builders of tech have this opportunity, and I hope that this book sparks something for you. Code is words made executable, so we must take care in what we say. And for those of us who see code as an apocryphal text, who see technology as indeed accelerating us towards a despondent, tightly controlled world, I hope this book reaffirms the power that you hold in being human and demonstrates ways certain technologies might actually serve open systems. To spark the Great Turning, we need to transform our compassion, our imagination, and our society. We cannot focus on reforming our technologies alone. And most of all, I hope that especially in this time, that this book can take you on a journey through parts of China that you might never visit, beyond a map of abstractions, beyond a flat map shaped by metronormativity. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Xiaowei, for that beautiful introduction. And I guess, you know, it's really, that really just captures, I think, what your book is really about. And I think what's so striking when I was reading through the book many months ago is kind of to review it really, was I was so struck by a few things about this book. One is how philosophical it is. It's kind of grounded in these questions about humanity and spirit. It really brings us into the world of rural China and then helps us kind of dismantle binaries around technology. that I just found so powerful about the book. And so I thought that such a beautiful introduction. It really captures a lot of this. And I think my first question really for you is this, and I think it's a question we're all dying to know. What is a blockchain chicken?
So it was an actual place that I visited, and it is a chicken that is heavily surveilled. Like it has a little ankle bracelet. The ankle bracelet tracks the number of steps that the chicken has taken. There's like a whole GPS system to make sure that the chicken hasn't left a certain area. And it lives in the mountains of Guizhou, this beautiful, idyllic area. The farmer that I met, he had been raising chickens like this for a while, so free-range chickens, but no one was buying them, and no one certainly wanted to pay such a premium price. And the reason behind that was that China has notoriously bad food safety. There's a low level of societal trust. So he was stuck like, okay, how do I convince people that this is real, that this is like a, free range, delicious chicken? So a Shanghai-based tech company was like, oh, blockchain. We can track the provenance using, the whole supply chain of this chicken's life, all the way to slaughter, all the way to delivery to your door. These chickens are quite expensive. They're like around $35 US, depending on the exchange rate. But upper class urbanites in Shanghai are more than willing to pay the price for food safety. So it also reminds me of the Portlandia sketch where they have all the information about the chicken when you go to the restaurant. So it's like that, but in reverse.
Reverse. I was just thinking about that Portlandia sketch, where you kind of learn the chicken's name and learn where it came from, and that's, I think that highlights one strong thing about this book here is like again to this theme of breaking down binaries. You're showing that a lot of like the practices that there's this tendency when writing about Chinese technology, like, oh, look at that strange thing over there. But a lot of those practices are actually these kind of global practices, things that I think a lot of folks can relate to once you start digging into the motivations. And that actually gets me to my second question for you is around your methodology. One thing I found really striking, I think right now, especially in this moment, a lot of China tech stories is really about the macro scale, right? These massive data farms, like AI taking over the world, and I can read countless headlines that are talking about this like massive scale, and yet you dive into the kind of miniature scale. You talk about individuals, you talk about individual companies, and so can you talk a little bit about your approach? Why did you take this approach as an author and researcher, and how did it inform the way you wrote the book?
I really appreciate this question because I think I have a firm belief that when we ask questions like, what is the future of tech? Or what is the future tech that will solve this food safety issue? We're actually asking, what is our future? Like, what is my day-to-day going to look like? And, will I stop facing technologically accelerated precarity? I also think, as writers and researchers, we have an enormous responsibility to the way that we represent and write about tech. One of the greatest exports of Silicon Valley is ideology and this idea that certain tech products are inevitable. It works really well as a way to control public opinion, to control policymakers. If you as a tech company say that the product or thing you're selling is inevitable due to whatever data that you randomly cherry picked. And so whenever I was reading those higher level, kind of abstracted pieces of writing that you're talking about, I always felt really disempowered. If a new AI is going to replace my creativity, if China is taking over the world, like why should I do anything about it? I might as well just settle in for the ride. And feeling resigned in this way, for me, is not a good feeling. And actually, as the next talk with Adrian and Joanne will talk about is, kind of how Silicon Valley shapes these ideas of So yeah, so writing at the human scale, making these empathetic connections, that's when things get messy. And that's when this kind of fiction that Silicon Valley, that big tech has sold us, like this fictions of the world really start to unravel. And I think that is the empowering place to be in, right? It's not about this book that says China is the future, because we are making the future. Like you and I, the rural farmer in China who's becoming an e-commerce entrepreneur, all of us, right? So this, I think it is a really important thing to look at tech on the ground, especially on the quotidian, day-to-day personal level.
Right, right, and that's, I think the book really brings that out, and I think one of the things I really appreciate is also how you bring in your experience living and working in the Bay Area as well, and make that kind of part of the human experience. Like there's these beautiful passages of just being in the BART station, seeing all these like stickers, how you have meetups and go to AI events, and what that looks like. And so it must have been such an interesting experience, kind of going from like rural China to back to the Bay Area. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think for many people it seems like these are like totally different worlds, and yet what I saw in the book is actually we're not as far apart as we think.
Yeah, I think even just on a material level, there's parts of the book where I talk about a Facebook live stream star in the US kind of, and then, what they're selling is these pearls. And I actually go and visit the oyster farm where they're producing these pearls. And there's numerous kind of endless products that are being sold on Facebook Live right now. I think that it really helped me get a sense of the contours of, what tech defines as like, what is being human, what it means to live a meaningful life, how do we live a meaningful life? And I think that contrast was really rich for me, especially in the Bay Area where, futurists are kind of a dime a dozen, and there's these ways of modeling and quantifying the future, then to go to rural China where you have folks who are coming in contact with e-commerce platforms, credit systems for the first time, their notion of time and what it means to live meaningfully, it's like still not this version of Bay Area, optimization and efficiency yet. Not to say that in a few years they won't be the same. But yeah, I think there's something about how beautifully mundane the tech world in the Bay Area can be. And you and I have talked about this. But it's a reminder, when I think a lot about my own experiences working in tech, that we're like all just trying to do our jobs the best that we can. And oftentimes what it means to, know the ethical boundaries of that, it's hard, it's difficult, right? And so once we experience that on the personal level, I think there's something really provocative about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about, this kind of contrast between the kind of personal, the kind of micro and the macro, I think something that's also present that it probably has shifted a lot since you first started writing about the book is kind of these shifts in China-US relations. And obviously COVID has had some influence on this. Where we're talking now, speaking of financial tech, Ant Financial has just launched their IPO in China, and there's all kinds of talk about that. TikTok might be banned, it might not. You and I wrote an article in Slate about WeChat and maybe being banned, maybe not. But I want to draw attention to an article you just wrote in The Nation about the Trump TikTok ban, right? And how this is, and you're making a connection here between the kind of fears and xenophobia around China and kind of the emerging possibilities of authoritarianism in the United States. And so can you talk a little bit about what's changed in the context right now since you started researching the book, and what can the book help us learn about and understand about this moment?
Yeah, so the piece actually, I always hesitate to get too academic or historical, but it's something I've been thinking about for a while. About a year and a half ago, I was in the Preilinger Library in their archives. There's a couple boxes that were labeled immigration. And it was all this stuff about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Page Act, all in the 1800s, which set the precedent for American immigration law, which became like race-based bans. And, you know, along with the xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment was also the rise of racism, eugenics, fears of the decline of the white race. In that same box on immigration, I also found a 3-part series at the Commonwealth Club about eugenics and why it's really great for, you know, public health. So I was really struck by and saddened by how, you know, this xenophobia and the fear of the foreigner, you know, even at that time was spawned to really reassert America's status quo, its special brand of white supremacy. And it really enabled, like, you know, both anti-Blackness and their erasure of Indigenous peoples. And so carrying that history through, like these tendencies that I saw in the archive, you know, also reading more about the civil rights movement, I think that oftentimes it was just really throughout history and reading it closely, it's like, wow, foreign policy really drums up certain domestic policies in the US. I mean, so much of the future is contingent on this next election. And all my family and friends in China they're making wild bets. We'll see who wins.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to have those continue to have those conversations about what's happening. And it seems like the seriousness of this moment really can't be overplayed in many ways, right? I think there's so much at stake with the election, but you're also highlighting a lot of the geopolitical stakes as well, and making those connections. And so one thing that I wanted to also draw attention to an excerpt of your book, and as I'm pasting this link in, I also want to encourage folks, if you have questions. I see a lot of mutual friends are in the audience, which is great. And I encourage folks to just submit questions, and we'll start DJing in some questions pretty soon. But I wanted to draw attention also to this Guardian article well, not an article, it's an excerpt from your book. And so for those who haven't purchased the book yet, I highly encourage you to purchase it through City Lights. But if you haven't, check out the excerpt for now, so you can see really what Xiaowei gets at. And there's one passage here in the book that I think I'll also just paste in. It's about how AI and pig farming kind of intersect, which I think is a surprising intersection, I would say, for probably a lot of people. And you write this quote here, that the demand for pork drives the industrialized farming of pigs, which increases disease transmission. That constant emergence of diseases, it drives implementation of new technologies. Technologies go on to make pork cheap, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can guess why this particular portion of the book is excerpted, because the thing we can't really ignore right now is the fact that we are living under a pandemic, and a lot of the attention has been put on China and Wuhan as and as a city, and possibly the role of markets and food. And your book really so much dives into the connections between food, production, capitalism, things like that. And so what can we learn from the book about this moment, and how, what are some of the frameworks that you're providing that can help us understand the kind of connections here? I think, again, a surprising one between AI, pigs, and actually epidemics.
Yes. So when I started writing this book, it was kind of like, dig into the China surveillance, AI, facial recognition stuff. And then once I dug deeper, there was this like whole body of literature in epidemiology, in animal science, ecology, where it's basically like this pandemic should not be surprising to us. And what I mean to say is that when I dug deeper, there's like 90% of technology is used on things that we don't see. Like, you know, Miriam Posner writes about supply chain software. It's also like algorithmic futures trading, commodities indexes. People are gambling on the price of grain. You know, Brazilian soybeans get shipped really cheaply and expediently all the way to China, never making it to a person's plate, but directly fed to hogs in China. And so I think I just felt such an affinity towards pigs that was kind of my interest. They're also doing fish face recognition. Like I could have written about another species. But I think, you know, hog farming is this like really interesting nexus of technology, environmental crisis, social inequity. And a lot, you know, when we are looking at the emerging science, this pandemic is really caused by wild animal habitat loss. Places like EcoHealth Alliance, there was a great New York Times article on this as well. But, you know, wild animal habitat loss is the result of humans just pushing more and more into the land. And industrialized farming is truly part of this in disrupting ecosystems. So, yeah, I think that that juncture of the unseen technology that's already there, that's already being used, maybe it's less glamorous, as well as environmental crisis and structural inequity is really at the heart of this book.
Right, right. And I thought you had some very powerful passages about this, about how we often tend to blame technology when looking at social ills without looking at the underlying conditions. And I think so much of the book really highlights that in so many powerful ways. And one question, you know, building from that is, you know, when we're thinking about this moment and your ongoing research, so much of the work you did, right, required you to be in China, required you to be hanging out with people, visiting places. What's changed since then? It seems like the ability to do research, like on the ground research, is quite limited at the moment. So what are the methodologies now? How can people be really becoming aware of life on the ground at this point in time where so much of our life is digital?
Yeah, so I actually think that the digital helps us a lot. It's funny, I sometimes feel like a grumpy old person when I talk to my students, because my students are like, oh, I like, you know, my social life is online. I do, you know, research online, all these things. And I think that's actually quite wonderful. You know, I think mutual acquaintance of ours, Trish Wang, you know, she's been doing some incredible digital ethnography, especially from afar. I use WeChat. I, you know, follow a lot of people digitally to try and just even in my WeChat circles, get the contours of what life is like. I think one thing that has struck me the most is I just remember, you know, whenever I go to China to research, people are very apologetic that China isn't modern. And they're like, so sorry, it's so dirty. It's not as nice as the US. And after this pandemic, China is really all in on the Western modernity train. And for me, that's kind of sad that like, there's gonna be no more wet markets. There's, you know, there's like something really beautiful about that creativity. And I fear that it might be slowly going away in the name of modernity.
Right, and I think, you know, so many histories of pandemics. You know, when we look at them, there's so many unintended consequences and changes that happen, and I think so much of your book is looking at those unintended consequences. Like, how does this one, you know, philosophy of AI or Bitcoin, how does that have like these unintended ripple effects? And I think I was looking at your Twitter feed the other day, and then when the book came out, and you're like, oh yeah, you know, I'm so happy I still agree with myself, and you know, just as an author myself, like I just totally relate to that, because you know, you write these books and then they don't come out for like, you know, for folks who haven't written a book before, sometimes it can take a year, 2 years till the book actually comes out. And so I think that's especially true though with China and technology, right? Like I go back to China about once a year when I can, and I'm just like, wow, so much has changed. And same with technology. It seems like if you don't have your ear to the ground, some of the changes are, can seem like they're coming pretty rapidly. So can you talk a little bit about how you keep up, like with what's going on, and what has changed? I mean, something has changed, I'm sure, in terms of since you finished the book. Like what's changed now? Like what is the new context in which this book is operating that might be different from when you're working?
To be quite honest, I feel like so much of my China research, I like physically need to be there.
Yeah.
Because there's so much coverage about China that's like quite sensationalist. There's a few I follow, like Abacus. There's a few reporters like Tianyu Fang, who I follow, Ri Zhong, and just a whole bunch of folks. I just follow like individual reporters, or scholars like Shazida Ahmed, who is coming out with like a new report, I think. But otherwise, there's a lot of fluff. And the only way I know if things are real or things are fluff is like actually going on the ground and talking to people. Just thinking of like so many instances, like even the recent, or I guess not recent, but like social credit stuff, and a lot of the reporting on that, the kind of surveillance and facial recognition stuff, it would make it seem like China is this place where you can't escape from anything. But of course, like the US, it's very unevenly distributed. So yeah, I have to say, I've been feeling a little dismal about what I will write about next, but I'm sure I'll figure it out.
Yeah. I think one thing that's so interesting about China, a lot of contemporary China writing right now, especially with tech, is just how the words like Orwellian come into mind, like words of like just how inescapable everything is, and so much of your writing is critiquing that, right? Is looking at both the systems and how unequal they are, but then also how these systems are actually probably part of a global dynamic that is often being obscured when we highlight one region. And I see a lot of China writers in attendance, and so in terms of like how you write about China, what are the pitfalls there that in terms of your writing that you think China writers need to really avoid when writing about China and technology? And then what are the opportunities when we have such an opportunity to look so deeply into a cultural and technological context?
It's hard. I think it's hard because there's the level of writing for US policy and policymakers who, a friend of mine likes to say that a lot of the politicians we see right now of the boomer plus generation, a lot of them were raised in the Cold War ethos, right? So kind of intrinsically in their bones, there's going to be a certain leaning that they'll have towards not only like how the balance of the world powers should be, but also how they view China, containment, all these things. I think writing for a general audience about China right now is also difficult, but it's in its own different way, which is how it's hard because I think the general public might, if you haven't been to China, you don't know the language, it's really easy to have like this kind of Orientalist view of it. So it's trying to strike the balance between saying like, okay, like, Shanghai and New York are not so different. But at the same time, there are these differences. So nuance is difficult.
Yes.
And that is the hardest thing. And then also having just a supportive editor who will allow you to put in nuance, because correct me if I'm wrong because you have more experience, but I don't think nuance really sells that well.
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It's really tough because we live in such an attention economy, that familiar frameworks like the Cold War, like Orwell, are often the ways that you actually bring attention to things that are significantly more complicated. You're reminding me of an Economist article I was just reading, that highlights that China is both an idea and a physical place, and we often conflate those two things. That the Western imagination, kind of treats China as this other land that can be in which all our fears and hopes can be projected, and yet, I think a good book, like a really excellent book about China, like yours, helps us get past that otherness and into the kind of lived realities of these experiences. And that actually gets to the other question I have for you is, as for a book about China and technology, you're also quoting very interesting folks like Grace Lee Boggs and Audre Lorde, like social justice writers, who are really steeped in kind of queer and racial justice theories and ideas. And so, why did you decide to bring these in? And I think for China writing and technology writing, these are we don't often associate these authors, and that to me it felt absolutely appropriate. And so, why did you decide to bring in these perspectives, and how in general does that inform your work?
I think that, at the core of any work, whether it's policy, writing about tech, software engineering, is a viewpoint onto the world of your ethics, your values, your value in ways of being. And for me, I read papers that are like China's digital Silk Road, stuff like that. I think that work is valuable. Policy papers, help guide research. But when it comes down to this stance that I want to take, the values that I espouse, it's definitely not going to be in the Cold War, somehow we only have political power through these official government channels. I think there's so many ways that we have agency in the world. And I think writers like Audre Lorde, Frantz Fanon, Grace Lee Boggs, through their writing and their activism and just their ways of being, really show us how powerful that is. And so I wanted to stick with the inspirational as opposed to maybe the more dismal, which always leaves me feeling like, oh, is going to policy school the only way to solve the world's problems? And I mean, as we're seeing in this moment, that's not right. There's so many things emerging, that have been bubbling for a long time, that people have been doing for a long time. Yeah. That is all about reenacting agency and power outside of these institutional systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of that is reflected just in your work as an artist too, and as a writer. And an editor. I think this notion of agency, I think, is really powerful. It's so much of the moment we're living in is teaching. It's almost like what I worry about this moment is that it's teaching us to not have agency. It's teaching us to just live in fear. And so your book really, I really appreciate that it has that perspective. That it's not just a history or like a narrative about China and tech, but it's a philosophy about what it means to be a human. And I just find that really powerful. I want to go to one of the questions that came in, and again, encourage everybody to send in your questions. This one's from Christy Kirch, and so in regards to accessibility, do you think expanding tech into rural farms is helpful for farmers?
So I go into this through several forms. In China, what I've seen is that I met up with a rural e-commerce entrepreneur, and that income is providing him and his family a new level of stability. At the same time, don't get me wrong, he's very cynical. He's kind of like, this buying ads online, it's a scam. Who knows how long this will last? A lot of people are trying to get in on this e-commerce game in the village. But, you know, it's a trade-off. There's also other villages that I visited where I think it's been really successful. And the reason why it's been really successful is because the platform for them is not a livelihood, it is a tool. So, you know, this rice farming village, they have this incredible governance structure that's dictated by the land, like the way that rice paddies are formed. They have this lottery system. They have like super long community meetings to negotiate about how they want to communally farm together. And it's a system of governance that I think that if the higher ups in government knew about, they wouldn't be too happy. But so this village is able to sustain these practices for themselves because they're just like, we use the internet to sell our stuff, to promote our stuff. It's really just a tool, but it's not bringing in like a new kind of core livelihood. So I think that kind of points to me like a real successful use.
Right, right. And next question is from Roger, who says, can't wait to read your book. And you know, as he says, you know, senses that many Americans are suspicious, even frightened of big tech, AI, facial recognition, killer robots, etc. Do you have any sense for whether folks in China are less suspicious or less frightened of big tech, AI, etc.? And why do you think so? Yeah.
I think everyone's kind of like, the robots are coming. The robots have had a very successful marketing campaign. But fortunately now, I think that so many researchers and writers are kind of like, that was a marketing campaign, and on the ground, there's glitches to this. You know, there is, of course, anxiety about automation, all the same things. And I don't think that it's actually like reassuring and also scary, just like how, you know, urbanites across the world kind of approach the killer robot idea. It's all very similar. Yeah.
Right. And how might this differ in like a rural context? I think one thing that was interesting, again, you know, with the book is, I think a lot of people, even those who visit China, rarely spend time in a rural area. And so I feel like that's one of the binaries you're breaking down. So, you know, you pointed out like, in urban context, we have these fairs. And what does it look like in the rural context? And whether in China, US, or elsewhere?
So that rice farming village that I visited, where I felt like using tech really successfully. One of the older farmers, he's just like so pragmatic. You know, you just like watch TV with him and just like there's like robot ads and things like that. And he's just like, why would you want that? This is like another example of city people having too much time on their hands, too much food, too comfortable. He's like, you know, he still uses the internet for news, communicating with his son and wife who are in the city working and sending money back home. But I think there's just like a kind of foundational sense of like, this is more about a difference in values than it is about technology solving some kind of problem. And, you know, when I talked about it with him, that's when I was like, oh, I get it. It's more like a reflection of our anxieties and our values about the future than anything that's really, you know, related directly to the tech itself.
Right. And I feel like both your book and this kind of this larger Logic Festival is really breaking down this idea that tech is neutral, isn't it? It's infused with values, and we choose the values that we want to bring to our technologies, and so whether that's rural China or Silicon Valley. Can you talk a bit about your life in Silicon Valley? I feel like that's an important part of this story, and you have some great anecdotes of of going to these meetups, talking to people who are machine learning engineers. How did your life in Silicon Valley and like in the Bay Area, how does that inform the way you thought about this book? Because I think it's pretty rare, obviously a lot of people live in the Bay Area, and this event is happening, technically in the Bay Area. But I think most people don't really have the opportunity to really interface with big tech, to work, work alongside or attend conferences with people who are actually building these tools. And so, how did that influence your approach to the book, and I guess in general your philosophy around technology?
So full disclosure, An and I used to work together.
Yes, that's right.
And after that, I moved on to a different startup. I think, I really truly have a lot of respect and love for all of the people that I met during my time working in tech. But I will say that one of the things that really struck me is that from the outside, you're like, yes, the beautiful office, the delicious ramen that gets brought to you, and the ramen person is making the ramen in front of you, and endless LaCroix and free snacks, which all sound great to me, especially right now. Right. But then talking to people, there's this approach to life, to living, where it's really about this kind of ambition, this rationality, this optimization, this life hacking. And, how do I hack my way to happiness? And there was a lot of resignation and sadness and discontent of just the people around me especially when I was working, that was kind of well, I'm doing all these things that are about life hacking, growth, and, optimizing, and life is an algorithm or whatever, but yet I still don't know my true purpose or direction in life. And that sense of being lost really stuck with me. I think that's what, I've been thinking about a lot recently, and sort of the next set of work that I'm really interested in is this kind of, the power that tech workers do have, and yet this simultaneous resignation and feeling pretty lost. So yeah, that doesn't really answer your question, but it was the impression that I left with.
Right. Well, I think that does answer the question in that sense. This really is, is what is the feeling of being in the Bay Area, right? And in so many ways, like you're saying, Silicon Valley is not just a place. It's also like China. It's an other land. It's a place where we project an idea of what is and what can be, and all our fears and hopes. And so in so many ways, you're looking at the narratives of these places, and it's that intersection of China, Silicon Valley, technology, AI that I think that this book is addressing in such an interesting way. In terms of sticking with the kind of the U.S. theme here, I think one of the interesting things about the book is how you highlight that not just that this flow of capital and technology to China, but also that China has these influences. Chinese technology has influences within U.S. markets and ways of living. Can you expand a little bit on that? What were some of the surprises you saw as you're preparing the book, and what are some things that just like the Pro vendor that you were writing about in the U.S. What are some things that wow, actually there's this whole market that's happening in China. There's this whole system that we may not be aware of. What were some of the surprises you saw?
Well, you probably know this as someone who's done research in China. There's just you and I were talking about how China is the biggest pumpkin producer in the world. I went to, this didn't make it to the book, but I went to China Chili City, where they're using big data to grow chilies, because China and India are the top chili producers, and it's just really easy and profitable to grow chilies, or not easy, but so that finding out about this kind of one side of, I would say, let's say red state America, where it's like you have these like MLMs and really Facebook live streamers, and they're like, or like even wish.com, which is this whole marketplace. It's this app that's like, selling Trump hats and like tactical vests for your German Shepherd. Like all of that is drop shipping from China. So this is like kind of one level of things that, me as someone who lives in the Bay Area, it's not really, directly in my worldview until I go look for it. I think there were other like fascinating ways to see just the original equipment manufacturers, which we've talked about before. A lot of banned manufacturers like Hikvision and Dahua, they're banned in the US because of their known ties to Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang. They also make like, white labeled products for Honeywell and many other American companies. So there's that.
I think the audience might not be familiar with the specific products they make.
Oh yeah, so they make surveillance cameras, and right now what's really popular is Hikvision makes these face recognition temperature monitors to check if you're wearing a mask or not. Especially given now it's become really popular in the US. So there's like that level of hardware. And then there's just like other crazy stuff that I like keep finding out. Like I really recently finished this book by Laleh Khalili called Sinews of War and Trade. And it's about like shipping and Saudi Arabia and like China's fiscal connections to the Saudi empire and ports and freight rates. And it's just like, okay, this is like conspiracy level stuff that I need to step away from. But yeah, I think of it as like those three levels.
Yeah. It can be dizzying, I think, sometimes to look at all the levels, and yet it seems so essential to really understand the picture. And it reminds me a little bit of just trying to understand the internet is hard enough. And so the many layers you're looking at are super tough. We have a question that's come in from Shinran. As a visual artist and filmmaker, when you are on the ground doing your research, do you feel compelled to document everything in its visual form through film, for example? And how do you combine and balance the kind of your artistic methodologies? And for folks who don't know, Xiaowei is in a fantastic arts practice as well, and includes a lot of media arts. And so this is what Shinran is really getting at. So how do you combine and balance your artistic methodologies and your scholarly ones?
Yeah, especially in my more recent visits to China, I've been trying to be more aware about the power between me documenting and recording others, especially if it's, I'm writing in a context where I might say something politically sensitive. I don't obviously want to endanger someone else. But I think as an artist, that also allows me to like come away with remembering things in a different way, whether it's, textures, sounds. I record a lot of sounds. I have like a ton of voice memos that I just keep recording. Smells, fabric, so my documentation has shifted less towards like, hey, let me take your picture with this, which has started to feel a little extractive to me under certain circumstances. And now it's more about like these objects and also especially food. I was gifted a lot of food by people during research trips, which I like didn't eat. Yeah, incredible food. It was great. I also gave away a lot of Ferrero Rocher, the little
chocolates,
yeah. So if you guys want to sponsor a future, no, just kidding. Yeah, I think the food too really was huge to me.
Right. So we're getting close to time, and I think a lot of. I feel like you could write a whole book just on your methodology, right? That's so much of what you just said there is so important about how we do research, right? And how to do that compassionately, how to do that in a way that's not, and also interesting, right? And not extractive. And so So I'm really glad you've highlighted that as part of your practice, because I feel like that's just as important a part of the conversation as the insights you're bringing. And so, again, just want to remind everybody, please support independent bookstores. City Lights is such a fantastic, wonderful bookstore that I've had the privilege of spend lots of time in, and Gray Area is an excellent independent art space in the Bay Area. And so please do support these independent spaces. Xiaowei's book is available through City Lights. You can see the link in the chat, and highly recommend snapping up this book. It's such an excellent and beautiful read. And so as we close, Xiaowei, I just wanted to give you the final say. Do you have any closing thoughts, parting thoughts for the audience as we think about the present, the future, China, the US, all these simple topics? Any closing thoughts there?
Say, remember what makes you human.
It's beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Xiaowei. And I think that's such guiding principles for all of us. And thank you to Gray Area, thank you to City Lights, and thank you to Logic for putting together this wonderful event.
That was a really excellent talk. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you, Xiaowei. Thank you, An, and thank you everybody for being present. I'd like to remind everyone, this session is going to be followed by another session tonight. We also have Adrian Daub in conversation with Joanne McNeil. The session is going to be called What Tech Calls Thinking. We also have a final session tomorrow, so please check out the Gray Area and the City Lights websites for more info on that. As mentioned, every book you purchase tonight really helps us out. We're an indie bookstore. We're having a hard time like everyone else, so it really does help us. So it helps make ends meet. So we thank you in advance for that. All these sessions are going to be rebroadcast, so if you know of anyone that missed them, or if you'd like to watch them again, please check out the Gray Area website, and they're going to be posting these sessions. So thank you once again. We'll see you in a short while. Have a good night. Bye-bye.